Hi, everyone. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Well, believe it or not, we've finally made it to 2021. I don't know about you, but for me, I'm excited about 2021 because 2020 was a terrible year for me. So maybe it was great for you. If not, I hope you have even a better year in 2021. But I'm telling you, for me, 2020, I am glad to see it in the rearview mirror, and I am hopeful that how much worse can 2021 be? I don't know. I guess we'll find out, but I wish you the best for you and yours. So today, I would like to talk about AVMA guidelines. I should have mentioned this sooner because, believe it or not, this came out in January 2020, so I've clearly been asleep at the wheel here. I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of some of the elements of the AVMA guidelines because so many wildlife control operators claim that they're following AVMA guidelines. You're not. And a lot of state agencies always are touting these as well. I'll talk more about why I think that's kind of a bad idea. But right now, I just want to review some of the highlights of the AVMA guidelines. If you haven't read them, then this would be the one you'd want to read. Don't read the early ones because they keep updating. And the last one that was available was 2013. And this one supersedes the 2013 because every so many years, depending on how the research comes out, they reevaluate and update their recommendations for animal euthanasia. So why don't we kind of got a lot to cover here. So why don't we get right to it? So if you want to get a copy yourself, just do a Google search, AVMA guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, 2020 edition. You probably can even get away with AVMA guidelines 2020 edition, and it should come up. You should be able to get it from the AVMA website. It doesn't cost anything. They make it freely available. And so I want to just cover some of the highlights here. So let's start off with page 16 about confirmation of death. We always want to make sure whenever we're killing an animal that it's dead before we dispose of the carcass. So good thing to remember all the time. Now, this isn't a change. This is something they've had in earlier elements, but it's good for us to remind ourselves what constitutes confirmation of death. Well, let's take a look. Combination of criteria is what they recommend are most, because it's most reliable. Here's what they suggest. Lack of pulse, breathing, looking for corneal reflex. What that means is you take a gloved finger and tap the eye to see if there's a blink response. If there is, obviously there would be a problem. The animal's still alive. You can also do a pinch of the toe, but you're looking for also lack of respiration as well. But sometimes with CO2, the animal is breathing very, very shallowly in a very shallow manner, and so it can be very difficult. So you really need to look carefully. Animals should be limp. Obviously, if an animal's standing up, it's not dead. Okay, so look for those particular elements and make sure the animal's dead. They do recommend for carbon dioxide that once breathing has stopped, and it takes probably 20, 30 seconds to confirm that, then you need to leave the animal in for at least another minute to make sure that it's completely stopped, because the respiration will need to stop first and then the heartbeat. You can even use stethoscopes and that sort of thing, but I doubt most wildlife control operators are going to do that. So the methods that I would certainly be looking to use: corneal reflex if it's not in the chamber, looking for lack of breathing, and you can also look for the flaccidness as something as well. You're looking for that total body relaxation. And then, of course, time is, so if you get experience with it, you'll know when an animal is ultimately dead. All right, well, let's continue on here. They have a section, of course, on inhalation products for euthanizing animals. Now, understand the AVMA has a different definition of euthanasia than we in the industry have. Let me explain what that is. To the AVMA, euthanasia can only take place when it's in the animal's interest and the animal is being put down in a manner that doesn't cause pain or distress. In our industry, we are focused on the method, which is how are we killing the animal, not the moral considerations around that decision. So the AVMA, for something to be euthanasia, we must be considering the animal's interest. We don't consider the animal's interest. So this is why I say if you claim to be following AVMA guidelines, then are you really saying that, well, I'm killing this animal for the animal's benefit? Now, that may certainly occur for some instances. For example, if you have a really mangy coyote, or maybe an animal's been hit by a car, or it looks extraordinarily injured or sick, then yes, then putting that animal down would be in its interest because you're trying to end its suffering. But for the vast majority of the animals that we're capturing them not because they're unhealthy or they're sick, but because they're bothering somebody. So we're not doing it for the animal's benefit. We're doing it for our client's benefit. Well, that's not euthanasia according to the AVMA. So it's important that when you claim to follow AVMA guidelines, you need to phrase it as, I am following AVMA suggested techniques, not AVMA euthanasia. It's a subtle difference, but it makes it because, again, for euthanasia in the AVMA standards, we're doing it for the animal's benefit, animal's interest, and we're doing the appropriate method of killing. We're not considering the animal's interest when we're killing most of our animals. Okay, just keep that in mind because it might come back to bite you. So let's talk a little bit here about carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is one of the methods that is permitted as a euthanasia technique in the AVMA guidelines. They do talk about some of the problems with it, of course, and you should know of this, that there's safety issues for the practitioner. The AVMA guidelines, when they evaluate a technique, they have something like 14 different criteria that they use to evaluate a particular technique. And this is the three main categories that those 14 criterion fall under. The first one is, of course, how will it affect the animal? Does the technique kill the animal in a almost painless manner? The second criteria that they use is how does it affect the applicator of the euthanasia method? So, for example, they're concerned about the psychological trauma to the people instituting euthanasia on animals, as well as how is it dangerous to the applicator? So what's the effect of this technique on the applicators? That's the second criteria. Then the third criteria is what happens to the carcass. Does the technique contaminate the carcass and make it dangerous for other animals who may consume that carcass? Does it poison the ground? So, for example, like when we use anticoagulants to kill rodents, for instance, those rodents are potentially toxic to other animals that consume it because of the issue of secondary poisoning. So that is a concern that they have. So those are the three broad criteria that they use for evaluating euthanasia. And then they have 14 specific guidelines underneath those three main criteria. All right. I hope that's helpful. You can read those for yourself. And again, this document is quite well thought out. This is a long-standing tradition of the AVMA, and they have some heavy-duty researchers and PhDs involved in this particular project, and they're doing a massive literature review as they're creating this. So I don't agree with all of it, and it's not that I think the science necessarily is bad. That's not the issue. My problem is the application of some of this data has some dangerous implications for our industry, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But when we're dealing with carbon monoxide, of course, safety is a problem because carbon monoxide is poisonous to us. And that is something that you need to consider. So you have to have good venting. But they also point out the problem of using gasoline-fired engines to create the carbon monoxide gas. So they're recommending you always use bottled gas. And for carbon dioxide, you have to. Okay, you have to do it. I believe they probably require that for carbon monoxide as well. But here's some of the issues with carbon monoxide from a vehicle. So don't do it, folks. First one is exhaust fumes from gasoline internal combustion engines may not have an adequate production of carbon monoxide. And that's partly because our newer engines burn a lot cleaner. There may be a catalytic converter that's involved there, so it may not have the same level of carbon monoxide coming out of it as vehicles in the past. That's problem number one. Problem number two is it's hot. Carbon monoxide generated from gasoline-powered engines create a lot of heat. So the gas that's coming off of it is hot. So you basically cook the animal that you're using it for. So unless you have a method of cooling that gas down, you're going to be cooking your animal. Okay, so don't use a device like that to euthanize your animals. Okay, now this is not talking about using the carbon monoxide generators like the Burrow RXs. That would not be euthanasia in the field. You're doing it as a kill technique, maybe humane dispatch, but it wouldn't be euthanasia. Okay, because of the conditions are different. So euthanasia requires the animal to be unconscious while it's going through death. And once an animal's unconscious, it can't feel pain. Humane dispatch, the animal can be conscious and still experiencing pain, but the death is rapid. That's an easy way of separating what constitutes a euthanasia technique from a humane dispatch technique. Now, the AVMA doesn't call it humane dispatch. They call it humane killing. That's one of my disputes with their document. It should be called humane dispatch to soften the intellectual blow. Words matter, folks. If you don't believe that, well, listen to politicians and how they talk. Words matter. You never hear a politician say they'll use the word free rather than your taxes have paid for this. Think there's a difference in how it's received by ignorant people? Yeah, there is. So words do matter. So definitely keep that in mind. All right, well, let's head down to page 44. We're going to talk about cervical dislocation. Now, cervical dislocation is still on the acceptable list of the AVMA, but there are some restrictions, and I don't think this is new. I don't believe this is a new policy, but they're kind of reinforcing, I would believe, some of this in terms of cervical dislocation. Now, cervical dislocation, think of it like hanging. You're separating the vertebrae from one another so that you're breaking the spinal cord, okay? It's primarily used for small animals. In fact, they would suggest that it has to be used in animals under 200 grams or 7.1 ounces. So this would be small birds, poultry, mice, immature rats, and rabbits. Now, that's not a very big animal. How about Canada geese? Too big. So if you're using cervical dislocation to kill a Canada goose, you're not using euthanasia. It's too big. So that would be humane dispatch, but it wouldn't be humane. It wouldn't be euthanasia. Okay. There is some evidence that some animals are still conscious after having cervical dislocation. That's a problem. This is why I'm concerned about some of these non-chemical techniques. I can foresee a day when they're not going to be available to us anymore in terms of, because of the influence the AVMA guidelines have on politicians and regulators. This is a threat. This is a danger to us. We need to decide as an industry what we're going to do in response to this, because we don't have access to the chemicals. And I'll talk more about that later. Okay, so this is an issue. All right, let's go to, how about kill traps? Kill traps are not going to be euthanasia. They would be considered humane dispatch, as I call it, humane killing, as they call it. But they do emphasize a particular problem. The kill traps don't always kill the animal in acceptable manner. There are international bodies that standardize, that do trap testing, and there's a standard for testing lethal traps so that the animal, and usually they're defined, they'll do like 10 animals, and they would require that 80% of the animals have to be unconscious within 90 seconds or 3 minutes or a bigger number in order to meet the guidelines. These types of traps are not perfect killing. So whenever you're telling, I was looking at a document, or just briefly, it was just a clip online, where a wildlife control operator was complaining, arguing to the government that we need to keep conibear traps because they can kill instantly. Not true, folks. Conibear traps, if they kill instantly, it's an accident. All the research shows they do not kill instantly. This is certainly supported by the AVMA, that documentation, and even research within various trap testing institutes. So never claim that the conibear trap kills instantly. It's simply nonsense. Okay? It's not true. However, depending on the type of trap you're using, if it meets the international guidelines, some traps are better at putting an animal to unconsciousness faster than others. Okay, the tube trap that's sold from wildlife control supplies. I don't make any money off that. I'm just pointing out one particular device that has met the UK trap standards, and I believe it also meets the Canadian standards. So that trap will put animals into unconsciousness at the right rate. It's not perfect because, again, it's only an 80% level, right? So if 80% of the animals go into unconsciousness by the required time, then it meets the standard. Okay, so it's not perfect, but it is reasonable, and the technology may improve over time. My point here is just pointing out that the AVMA recognizes that, and they do see a value in kill traps, which is amazing, right? They understand that in the field, it may be more humane to use a kill trap in the woods than it is a cage trap. You say, how is that possible, Stephen? Because the animal caught in a cage trap may suffer hypothermia waiting for you to come back and check the trap, where if it was caught in a conibear trap, it could be dead in a few minutes. So if you calculate how much suffering the animal would have to endure for 2 or 3 minutes versus 10 hours, do the math. And that's something that I just want you to understand, how sophisticated and how detailed and how nuanced this AVMA document is. If you really want to be challenged about your understanding about euthanasia, this is a document you want to read. Now, thankfully, you don't have to read all of it because it's 121 pages long. But if you read about 20 pages of it, I would have you read the introductory section. That's going to be probably 4 pages. And then read the sections related to the techniques that you use. That would be the shooting section. I would read the cervical dislocation section. I would read the carbon dioxide section. If you use carbon monoxide, I would read that section as well. And then I would read the appendices. The appendices have a brief way of saying, is this technique acceptable for this particular species? Because they do everything on the basis of species and class or order. I guess rodents are the order. And then they have a final section where they talk about where to place your captive bolt. If you're using captive bolt, you say, well, Stephen, I don't use captive bolt. That's fine, but it tells you where you want to put the bullet. Now, they don't have wild animals on there, but it could help you conceptualize for the animals that you do handle. Is this animal more like a pig? Is this animal more like an ox? Is this animal more like a rabbit? Is this animal more like a fish? And then you can try to use this as an analogy to help you understand bullet placement, to have shooting as a euthanasia technique. Because shooting, if it's done properly, can be a euthanasia technique. All right, so there's a lot of information in this document. Thankfully, you don't have to read all of it, but if you read about 20 pages of it, it'll really give you a sense of what they're thinking about, and it'll challenge yourself as well. And I think that's valuable for industry because a lot of wildlife control operators don't think deeply enough about euthanasia. All right, well, let's keep going here. So let's see what page I'm at now because I have some additional notes here. All right, so we're at 46, so let's go to 97 now. Notice what they have here in terms of the AVMA. They recognize the complexities of dealing with free-ranging wildlife. And that's commendable for them. They recognize that those of us in the field don't always have the ability to have precision methods that you would have in a veterinarian's office, right? When you're dealing with a raccoon in the field, things are a lot different. There's a lot more complexity there. They recognize that complexity. Now, they probably don't recognize the complexity as much as we might, right? So their bias is going to be toward the animal, and they'll say, well, you could have done better there. And that may be true. It may not be fair. Okay. The point is they do recognize that you may be killing an animal, and not necessarily the perfect way, but it can still be considered euthanasia according to their standards because of the situation that you're involved in. That's good news. Now, that's pretty fuzzy, but at least there's an acknowledgement there. Now, what I have a problem with is, why is the AVMA talking about wildlife in the first place? They're supposed to be dealing with veterinary work for domestic animals, right? I mean, I guess you could talk if you're dealing with a wild animal in your lab or a wild animal in your, in a study, then that would be one thing. But why are they talking about us? And this is something that I've pointed out more and more to people. They need to understand is that people involved in domestic animal care are trying to use domestic animal laws and impose those laws on wildlife. Now, if you look at your state will distinguish between the treatment of wildlife and the treatment of domestic animals. In other words, you can shoot a deer, but you can't shoot your dog. Why? They're both animals. Well, one's a domestic animal, and there are different rules, cruelty laws, governing domestic animals than there are for wildlife. Now, there are cruelty laws for wildlife. They're not well defined, but they're certainly a lot more looser than they would be for domestic animals. And the point is my concern here is that the AVMA keeps commenting about wildlife, and wildlife managers and animal rights activists and animal welfareists and animal protectionists are trying to use the AVMA guidelines as the standard for dealing with wildlife in the field. And sometimes wildlife control operators are supporting that. And I'm telling you, that's a dangerous place to be, because that can eliminate different kinds of techniques that we need to have in the field. Now, I'm not married to carbon dioxide. I'm not married to carbon monoxide. I'm not married to other forms of that we're using now. My problem is that we will lose techniques without someone replacing them with something different. I would argue that if the government would give us access to barbiturates, then I would be less resistant to losing other techniques. But they're not going to give us barbiturates without a fight. They're going to take away a technique before they're going to give us a new technique. Because when we talk about carbon dioxide, and I didn't mention carbon dioxide, let's talk about it. Carbon dioxide is still allowed as a euthanasia technique, thank God. But as I said before, and I believe I've done it here on the podcast, there are concerns about animals suffering while being exposed to carbon dioxide. Now, there are 3 ways animals suffer from being exposed to carbon dioxide. The first one, a lot of us are familiar with, and that is the carbonic acid that forms when the carbon dioxide meets the moisture in our nose. That creates carbonic acid. That's sort of like when you ever get soda up your nose, maybe when you're a kid, you drank it too fast, it went up your nose. That burning sensation you had, that was the carbonic acid. If you've seen an animal shake its head inside of a gas chamber that you were putting in carbon dioxide into, that's the carbonic acid forming in their nose. This is part of the reason why the AVMA wanted us to use low flow going into the gas chamber. It was anywhere from 10 to 30% per minute, so that in 5 to 3 minutes, the chamber would fill. Because they wanted us to try to reduce the risk of that carbonic acid burning. The second way animals suffer is what's called air hunger. And that is if you've ever felt short of breath or you weren't getting enough air, that's the experience, the panic you get from air hunger. They're saying that there's some research with carbon dioxide that shows that animals undergoing carbon dioxide euthanasia are experiencing that air hunger. And if you're experiencing air hunger, that's not euthanasia, right? So this is the problem. The third reason why animals are suffering is a chemical reaction that's occurring in the brain. It's a little bit more technical than I would want to go into now, but so that's a third reason. Why do I point that out to you? Is that I can foresee a day when we lose carbon dioxide as a euthanasia technique. There could come a day when the AVMA decides, if more research comes in and they say, you know what? The evidence shows that carbon dioxide does not kill an animal painlessly, and therefore it gets dropped down to humane killing. And for some of you, that may be the kiss of death, because we may lose this technique because your state agency may say they're going to eliminate that technique as an option. That's a problem. Can you imagine if we were all forced to use barbiturates and we don't have access to barbiturates and we're required to go to a vet in order to get the injection, and the vet says, no, the AVMA guideline says I can't kill this animal without, because I'm not doing it for its benefits. So what are you going to do? Now we're going to be forced to do everything one-way doors. Not opposed to one-way doors. I believe in one-way doors. But can you imagine being forced into using one-way doors? What would that do to the cost to your client? How many poor people can afford that kind of labor, especially with people who haven't been able to maintain their houses? Does that mean that they don't have the right to control wildlife on their own property and get it resolved? You know, grandma up there with a fixed income who can't afford getting her house fixed, who needs the squirrels out of her attic. These are complex issues here, right? So this is something we need to be thinking about. This is why. But let me step back for a moment. So you heard about those 3 reasons why carbon dioxide can be a problem. However, they still came down on the side of carbon dioxide meeting the guidelines because it does have a narcotic effect. They did make a change, and the change was basically this. The change was for rodents, the standard now is fill the chamber between 30% and 70% per minute. So that means you're filling it within 3 minutes or so, or perhaps in under 2 minutes. That's a change where before, as I said before, it was 10 to 30% per minute. Now they want you to fill it for rodents between 30 and 70%. Now you say, well, Stephen, that's a pretty big range. What do I do for a squirrel? Well, I'm going to just tell you here that you're going to need to check it out. Monitor your squirrels for a little bit and try them at 30% and see how they act. And then try another batch at 40% and see how they act. Now, man, the 40% is not how much CO2, what the percentage of CO2 is in terms of its purity. You're using pure CO2 when you're filling it into the chamber. The 40% is related to how fast you're filling the chamber. So at a 40% rate, you're filling 40% of that chamber within 1 minute. And then the second minute would be another 40%. And then the next half a minute would be the last 20%. That's what we mean by the percentage. So that's how fast you're filling the chamber per minute. So they're changing that for rodents, 40 to 70%. That's a big change. So you're going to need to decide and learn about which method, which percentage rate is better for which species. That's going to require some record keeping on your part. You say, I'm too busy for that. No, you're not. You need to do this. It just takes a little bit of time. Find out what percentages work best for what percentage works best for rats, what percentage works best for woodchucks, what percentages work best for gray squirrel, fox squirrel, red squirrel, flying squirrel. I think that's probably in beaver. right? What percentage works best for beaver as well. So you're going to need to keep that up. So anywhere between 30%, I believe it's 30% to 70%. Let me make sure I go back and check that just to make sure I'm not sending you down the primrose path, as they say. So let's get down to here. Yeah, 30 to 70% change. Okay, so check it out. Learn about how you're going to do that for the various rodent species that you deal with. So you're using the best percentage for those species that you handle. All right, let's keep going. So I think I went to I didn't go to 110 yet. Went to 97? Yes, I did. So now 110. They have a wonderful glossary. Now remember, we said earlier, they call humane killing that second level of killing of animals. So euthanasia is the top, but the next best is humane killing. I don't like the phrase humane killing. I like to call it humane dispatch. It's a little bit softer, and I would encourage us as an industry to use the phrase humane dispatch as a replacement for humane killing. You may say, Stephen, why are you so technical? I'm telling you folks, words matter. If you don't believe that, to ask a politician. Words matter. If you're married, ask your wife how you respond to things and what words you use. It matters. And we as an industry need to start standardizing our language, because that shows maturity within our industry and also helps us politically as we're dealing with the public and with politicians. But if we're not talking with a unified voice here, we are in trouble. And I know a lot of people ignore this until the crisis hits. I'm warning you. I'm warning you. I'm warning you. I'm begging this industry to wake up and start getting better organized. All right, but I digress. Let's keep going. Let's go down to page 111 here. So this is the appendix I was telling you about. They have several. This would be some pretty easy reading. This allows you to go by species or animal groups, and it will tell you very quickly what methods are applicable. Now, you can't simply rely on the appendix. They're very clear that especially when we talk about the acceptable with conditions, you have to learn about what those conditions are, and that requires you to go back and refer to the longer text. This is a kind of a quick way of knowing what methods work. Why am I pointing this out to you? One, so that you're aware of it, because it saves you a lot of time when you're reading the document. But I also want to point out again, notice how often you're seeing something in that. Barbiturates, 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 barbiturates. Are you getting a theme here? Immersion, buffered benzocaine. You think we have access to benzocaine? Barbiturates, injected barbiturates, or anesthetic overdose, injected barbiturates. This is a problem, folks. Now, I'm not claiming that the AVMA is just concerned about helping themselves. What I'm saying is it is convenient that the methods that pass their muster, they have access to. Now, unless you have access to a vet who is willing to hand to you the barbiturates, we're stuck. So if we lose these other techniques like carbon dioxide, or we lose gunshot, or we lose carbon monoxide, or we lose cervical dislocation, if we lose those things, what we're forced to go to ultimately is barbiturates. Who has access to barbiturates? You have to be a doctor in this country to get access to barbiturates, or connected to a university. This is my problem, part of my problem with the AVMA guidelines being given so much weight. Unless the AVMA changes its attitude and starts thinking we're not going to require a technique unless we're assuring that people who need it have access to it. And I doubt that's going to happen. I don't see the AVMA lobbying Congress to allow wildlife control operators the tools and the licensing necessary to get narcotics that are regulated by the DEA. Now, I could be wrong down the road, and I hope I am. I would love to be wrong. Because what I don't want is I'm not married to carbon dioxide. I'm not married to some of these other techniques. But if you take something away, you need to replace it with something else that's at least cost effective and practical. And that's what I'm afraid we're going to lose. So if we keep talking up the AVMA guidelines, we're basically telling people to rely on a standard that's ultimately going to bury us. Why would you do that? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'm not telling you not to read it. This is an important document to read. Thankfully, you don't have to read all of it because it's challenging, and we need to be challenged in our industry. Sometimes we get a little too cavalier, but it's important for us to be challenged by it. But I just want to caution you, we need to develop our own standards. And where would I recommend, Stephen? I would say American Society of Mammalogists would be a place to start. Because a lot of these things are not scientific in the sense that I'm not saying the data here isn't scientific, but some of the decisions about science are moral. They're not scientific. This is the problem. Science, everyone thinks science is sort of the end all and be all. No, it's not. It's a very important tool, but it doesn't answer every question. Those are often philosophical questions and moral questions, not scientific questions. And sometimes scientists like to get out of their lane and say things that they really don't have scientific evidence for. They're actually making a moral claim. And now you're getting into my field, because as many of you know, I'm a trained minister, okay, trained theologian, I should say. So now we're getting into my field, and they like to overstep their bounds all the time. Okay, so I certainly don't want it. I have some philosophy training as well. All right, so keep that in mind. This is why you need to be organized. This is why we need to be pushing our organizations to develop euthanasia and humane dispatch standards to act as a competitor for our agencies, because our agencies are looking for standards because they don't want to deal with it themselves. They just want to adopt something. We need to make it easy for them to adopt something that's suitable for us. And that's very doable. All right, let's keep going. I have one more section for you that I want to show you because this is pretty neat. This is where they have some diagrams that show where you want to place some of these injections or captive bolts. Here they have places for shooting. Now, they don't have wildlife, so that's a little bit of a downer on that in the sense we would be nice to have, things like raccoon and skunk and squirrel and this sort of thing. However, my point here is I think a lot of you're smart enough, you're business owners, you're technicians, you're problem solvers, you get it. You know how to observe the cranial structure of different animals and say, where do I need to put that bullet to have maximal damage to the brain so that I have a euthanasia technique when I'm using shooting. The reason why shooting is considered euthanasia is that the bullet's destroying the brain faster than the animal can feel the pain. It's really that simple. But placement is critical to get the desired result. Now, it may be twitching all over the place, but it's no longer conscious, and that's what matters for us. Okay, but notice the placement here. If you ever have to do cat control, this is certainly important where you want to put that type of shooting. If cattle, here we have a rabbit where you're going to be shooting. Notice there's a pattern here about where you're placing these bullets. Here you have some horned animals. Buffalo, of course, is wildlife. That would be important. We have other animals like oxen or water buffalo as an example here where you're putting the base placement. And they also show you where you're going to shoot, not only shoot, but use captive bolts as well. So all of this can be very helpful for you in terms of understanding bullet placement. And then, of course, make your own observations as well when you're skinning animals or you happen to see a skull. Look at where is the brain inside the capsule. Look at some anatomical magazines or journals to see where the brain is, where you make sure you put that bullet placement correctly. And so, again, be that naturalist. Take the effort, take a little bit of the time to make sure that your technique meets appropriate standard to kill the animal. We don't want to be respectful. Sometimes we get cavalier in our work. And I think one advantage with the AVMA guidelines is it does challenge us to be sure, are we using the best techniques available and are we implementing those techniques with the highest standards? And I think that's important for all of us as professionals. And I do commend the document for that. So I'm just showing you some more photos here. Here we have how to kill an alligator, and even how to strike a fish, and how to pith a fish. Pretty interesting stuff. Again, it's quite long, 121 pages. Thankfully, you don't have to read all of it. It's available online. I encourage you to download it. If you're claiming you're following AVMA euthanasia guidelines, I'm telling you right now, you're not. But I will say, though, you could say I'm following AVMA tech guidelines regarding euthanasia technique. That, I hope, would be accurate, because I do think a lot of their techniques for carbon dioxide are appropriate for us. I'm nervous politically and ethically about what the impact these documents are going to have for us, especially as more and more agencies are seeing these folks as the standard. And that's what I'm denying. I'm denying that the AVMA is the standard for wildlife. And I think as an industry, we need to be thinking very carefully about always mentioning AVMA, AVMA, AVMA. When you keep mentioning it, that means you're giving them the credence. So when they come out with a new ruling, you have to adopt it, and be careful about that. I'm very concerned about where this is all going to go, because I think I'm looking for a day, hope I'm wrong, where carbon dioxide is going to be eliminated. And that's probably the most convenient thing that saved a lot of wildlife control operatives, especially those who work in urban areas where they can't do shooting. So this is a problem for us, and I'm just giving you a warning cry. Read the document, be challenged by it, try to improve your service, get politically active, encourage your wildlife control associations to start thinking about making a policy to creating euthanasia guidelines. All right. Well, this is quite a way to begin the year. I'm already 41 minutes in. So I'm Stephen Van Tassel, wildlife control consultant, giving you another podcast here of Living the Wildlife. Hey, take a few moments, drop me an email, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Join our group on the Pest Geek Podcast on Facebook. Subscribe to our channel. We would love to have you subscribe as well and get your episodes every week. And if you have ideas or suggestions, questions, criticism, definitely reach out to me at my email at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. And remember, why do we call this Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife. We don't want you to be the wildlife. Thanks so much for listening. Let's have a great year, everybody. Take care.